This episode is sponsored by Learn Light and Sound and me. We have courses on how to improve your lighting and sound for video, linked down below. First, let's get you some samples from some professional grade and some prosumer lavalier microphones. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you were quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you were quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. Now, lavalier microphones and boom microphones that we use in video production, they're all tools. And every tool has its pros and cons, so let's talk about the pros and the cons of lavalier microphones. This will help you decide when to choose which one. Maybe if you're making YouTube videos and you're going to do it in a little spare bedroom in your house or whatever, maybe a boom microphone is the best choice for you. Maybe a lavalier microphone is, but let's talk about those pros and cons so you can make that decision. First of all, pros. You don't require big stands or boom poles or any sort of rigging. You wear them. You attach them to your body instead, so that makes it a lot easier. If you're using the mic with a wireless transmitter or a body recorder, the talent can move around freely. You're not tied to one spot. You can freedom. That's a big, big deal with lavalier microphones. Now, you have a really good signal-to-noise ratio with lavalier microphones because you're wearing the microphone, which means the microphone is very close to you, the sound source, and it's not as close to the noise. So that actually helps in terms of getting a nice, clean recording. It also blocks sound from behind because it's being worn on a body. And so if you're wearing it down here in the chest area or out at the lapels, your body is blocking some of that sound from behind. So that's helpful as well. Now, there are some cons, and we need to talk about those. Number one, where the mic is positioned makes a huge difference in the sound that you capture. Huge difference. So if you put it up near your throat, it's going to sound much throatier. If you put it down on your chest, it's going to pick up more chest resonance, bassy sound. If you put it off to the side, it's going to pick up a little bit more of the higher frequencies. If you put it up at the neck, it's not going to pick up as many of the higher frequencies. If you put it up on the forehead or up in the hair, it will follow as you move your head around. So there are lots of considerations, but it can be a challenge, and it may sound different every recording you get, depending on where you put the microphone. So it's going to require oftentimes some equalization or EQ in post-production, and in some cases some other post-processing as well to get it really sounding the same as a boom microphone might. This may come as a surprise to some people, but lavaliers typically produce more self-noise than boom microphones. Let me put some stats up on the screen here for you. Let me just highlight two. Sanken COS 11D, classic professional grade lavalier microphone, $400 and some dollars. I think it's approaching $500 maybe. 28 dB A-weighted of self-noise. Sennheiser MKH 416 boom shotgun microphone, 13 dB A-weighted. So there's a pretty substantial difference in terms of how much self-noise, and you can see the others here as well. The max SPL spec varies a lot. The loudest sounds that lavalier microphones can record really depends on the lavalier microphone. For example, you'll definitely want to look at these specs before you make a choice about which mic to use if you're going to record louder sounds. The Rode Lavalier 2, max sound pressure level of 106 dB. Shure TL47, 142 dB SPL. Countryman B6, 120 dB SPL. And a lot of the pro-grade lavalier microphones come in low sensitivity versions. Those are made specifically for recording louder sound sources, and they're often used in theater with singers that have extraordinarily loud voices. So there are options out there. Just be careful and make sure you check that if you are going to be recording loud sound sources. Typically, lavalier microphones have less dynamic range capability than a quality boom microphone. So basically, if you look at the difference between the max SPL and the self noise, that's going to roughly give you an idea of what your dynamic range is, and a lot of the microphone specs will cite the dynamic range. Oftentimes, the dynamic range on lavalier microphones is less than what you could achieve with a quality boom mic. Hiding lavalier microphones is a challenge in and of itself. Clothing rustle is often a huge issue, and so it's a constant battle. With practice, you can get good at it, but it's always going to be a little bit of a challenge depending on what the person's wearing. And we haven't even talked about the challenges that come along with wireless yet. Now, if you're using a 2.4 gigahertz wireless microphone system like the Rode Wireless Pro, Go, Me, the DJI mic, the Hollyland mics, and the 10,000 other seeming companies that have knocked off or ripped off those concepts, they're pretty easy to use, and especially if you only need 2 channels. They work pretty well. If you're in pretty close proximity to them, you're not working at a stadium or some venue where there's a ton of other wireless traffic, they can actually work pretty well. As soon as you move to 4 channels, things start getting dicier. And it really depends, again, on the location that you're at and how much Wi-Fi activity there is and how much other 2.4 gigahertz activity there is from other consumer devices. So if you need a lot of channels, those may not be the right thing. UHF wireless microphone systems are great because you can tune them to different frequencies. So you got a little bit more room and the ability to control things a little better. But it does take some learning and some education. And you also need to spend more money to get those systems as well. We will have a course coming on UHF wireless microphone basics here in the next couple of months, so hopefully that'll help you if you are deciding to go that direction. So now here's the summary overall. If you're recording seated talking head interviews and just little explainer videos for YouTube or TikTok or whatever you're doing, you might be fine with a boom microphone. And actually that just might make things simpler. If you're doing it in the same place in a spare bedroom at your house or whatever, that may be the easiest thing. But if you do need the freedom of moving around a little bit more, by all means, go with a wireless lavalier microphone of some sort, but you're going to have to learn how to use them. And with all of them, remember, whatever you choose, a boom microphone, a lavalier microphone, remember that technique and understanding, if you're using wireless theory and practice is probably 80% of what goes into making good quality recordings, and the other 20% is the gear that you use. So there's some education you're going to need to do. So with that, get out there and make some great sound.